Hello, my name is Sarah Obermeyer, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Nursing at Azusa Pacific University. And on behalf of Azusa Pacific University School of Nursing, and in collaboration with the Iota Sigma chapter of Sigma Theta Tau and the Orange County Society of Pediatric Nurses, it's my pleasure to be here with Juli Boit to celebrate and learn more about her recent book. The book is called From Beyond the Skies, An Invitation into the Wonder of Love. Juli is a former graduate of APU and a past alumni of the year from the university. Juli's an author, a community builder, a nonprofit leader working at the intersection of faith, global health, and human dignity. For 17 years, Juli has lived and worked in Africa, founding and serving as International Director of Living Room International, a community-led nonprofit providing hospice and palliative care services to adults and children in Western Kenya. Through her training as a family nurse practitioner, she has combined her dual passions of healthcare and social justice into a unique expression of love that is providing desperately needed services in an underserved community. Juli would be the first to add that she's the one who has been loved the most by her patients and neighbors in her home village of Kipkaren, most notably by Titus, her Kenyan husband, and their children, Sharon, Alice, Ella, Joffrey, and Ryan. Juli's new book, releasing in September, chronicles her journey of moving to Kenya, founding Living Room International, and becoming the adoptive parent of 3 children with sickle cell disease. Do you want to just start by giving some context about your family and what you do on a daily basis in Kenya, what your life looks like there?
Sure. So like the intro said, I'm married to Titus, and we have 5 kids that are living with us, and I have the privilege to live in a rural village in Kenya and to help lead hospice work at 2 hospices. One is near Eldoret, Kenya, and the other is in a village, and we get to serve thousands of adults and children who are needing hospice and palliative care services and trying to make an impact on the larger healthcare sector. And in 2016, I had been running Living Room for about 7 years at that time. And I went on a Friday afternoon to the hospice, and unbeknownst to me, there was going to be a 3-pound baby wrapped in a pink blanket whose mama had died in childbirth and whose father had died on a roadside accident a few months prior. And this 5-day-old baby had survived on water alone, is what the story that was told to me. And I held him in my arms, and his relatives had named him Ryan. And I held this baby named Ryan in my arms. And, I've taken care of thousands of children during my time in Kenya, but for reasons that I don't even know if I fully understand in that moment, I so desperately wanted this child to be able to live. So a few weeks later, after Ryan, we took him to the NICU so that he could get the proper care that he needed. That was during a time where there was a strike in the hospital, and so there were hundreds of premature babies in this NICU, and so Ryan shared his incubator with a couple of other babies. And when it was time for him to leave, my husband and I, in meeting with Ryan's extended family, decided that we would take care of him for a season to try to give him a chance to live. And so we did that, and that step led to a lot of other steps. But Ryan is the youngest of 8 brothers and sisters, and so Ryan, eventually we were able to adopt Ryan and become guardians of the other children. And it's been a journey that I didn't know would be one that would be our family's, but I'm really grateful for it.
You didn't anticipate being the mother of 5 children, going from 1 to 5.
Yeah.
But Ryan was the thing that led you to those other children as well.
Yeah, and Ryan was a baby that, if we hadn't taken care of him, really would have been a child-headed household. And I just think his chance of survival, eventually when he also would be diagnosed with sickle cell disease, I just think his chance of living would have been really, really almost impossible.
Could you speak for a minute about Living Room International and how that was started and how it's grown into 2 hospices now?
Sure. So I moved to Kenya in 2004. I was a 25-year-old nurse practitioner. I had gone on short-term mission trips with Azusa Pacific when I was in undergrad there. And then when I finished, I began to work as a nurse in HIV care in Los Angeles. But the HIV pandemic was really in my heart. And so I eventually decided to go and work in the community of Kipkaren with some really remarkable Kenyan leaders. And I signed up for a year, and that was 17 years ago. And we did so much care within the community, home care and getting people tested and connected to HIV treatment. And at the time, there were just so many obstacles in the way of people being able to live with HIV. But through, I would say, holistic care, the physical, emotional, and spiritual care, we were able to see remarkable things happen within the area. But I continued to see suffering that needed something like a hospice, a place of refuge, which is what the hospice is named in Swahili, Kimbilio. We needed refuge for patients with HIV and eventually cancer, and just the pain and suffering that wasn't being well addressed or managed in other places became something really deep within my soul and within our community. We were able to dream that and watch it come to fruition. So now there's 2 sites. So we have a 24-bed inpatient facility that is a free service in Kipkaren. It's a rural community. And we do home care also. And then in Eldoret, it's a 49-bed. It's actually a level 4 hospital, which means that we can do other things other than hospice within the center, but we serve adults and children and really focus on chronic disease management and end-of-life care.
How did you know that this was your passion? What was it in you that rose up to make you know that this was what you were meant to do?
Well, I had this, it was like this compelling thing within me that no one should die alone. And then also a prayer that if others are needlessly suffering, never let me be comfortable with that. And I don't think I necessarily pray that prayer anymore, but I think I get to live it each day. And I think the other thing that has really been a guiding question for me is, what does it look like to love in this situation? And then day by day figuring out how that can actually be lived out.
That is a good segue to this book. What does it look like to love in this situation? Why did you write this book? What is it that drove you to write this?
So I wrote this book, I think, for multiple reasons. One being, we had walked a really hard journey, one where I think nearly impossible things happened, and I needed to process it. But I wrote it for my children, because they're likely not to remember a lot of it, and I'm grateful that they don't necessarily have to remember it, but I want them to know how deeply loved they are and how much we fought for them to have life and freedom from sickle cell disease. I also wrote it when, I think we'll talk about this more, but when our son Ryan was undergoing his bone marrow transplant to be cured of sickle cell, he ended up in the ICU and was terribly sick. And I asked the family we were living with, when Ryan came out of the ICU, I asked Mel, can you say thank you to these nurses and doctors who helped to save your child's life? And he said, well, you can't repay them, but you write them a letter of thanks. And I think of this book mostly as my complete letter, the letter that I couldn't write at that time, but that I want to share with everyone who walked with us on this journey.
That idea of remembering is so important, both in our faith background and just looking at history. I think there's this lack of remembering. And so creating something like this that just says, hey, this is what you need to know about this story and how much you are loved. And then also remembering the people who've journeyed with you in little moments and in larger moments.
Yeah.
Too.
And even for people who may not even know that they journeyed with us, but something about like a writing or a song or different things, like I'm feeling compelled to share, to write them a letter and send the book and just say this was part of the journey for me that helped to carry us along the way.
That's lovely. Well, so this is about a story about 3 children with sickle cell, 2 of whom are the 2 that had the bone marrow transplants. But could you speak for a moment about sickle cell, what that diagnosis comes with, and a little bit about some of the treatments that may have been available or have not been available?
Sure. So sickle cell disease is it's a genetic red blood cell disorder that in my children's case that they had the SS form, which is considered the most severe. And it's where each of their parents would have had the trait and passed it on then as the disease for the kids. In the U.S., there's about 100,000 people who have sickle cell disease. The life expectancy is mid-40s. But in sub-Saharan Africa, it's estimated that 150,000 to 300,000 children are born each year with sickle cell disease, and that up to 90% die by the age of 5. So the disparity for life expectancy, but also even getting a diagnosis is, it's so dramatically different. And I remember the day that I received Ryan's diagnosis. He was 6 months old. He had been with us since he was a newborn, and when he started to have pain and we didn't know what it was, and eventually would get a PDF emailed to me that said, he had sickle cell disease, I had to process and grieve what that meant and think about the geography of where we lived and how that would impact whether he could actually survive to be 2 or 5, and wanting so much more than that for him. And then to get the diagnosis for his brother Geoffrey and his sister Alice. I remember on that day talking to my parents who were on the other side of the world by phone and just saying, I don't want this for Ryan, I don't want this for our family, but I don't really want this for any of our neighbors too who live with this and whose children suffer without access to pain medication, without the even things like the vaccinations or hydroxyurea or some of the things that we have in place in the U.S. that really give them a better chance to live and to deal with the suffering that does go along with the disease.
There's this thread that I'm hearing of how you felt called to walk alongside of people who were suffering, and that's why you went to Kenya. And then you had to do it in your own personal life. Yeah. And we're called to do that as a mother. And so what was that like for you as a mother to get that diagnosis for your own children and to know the weight of that as a nurse?
Well, I had sat beside so many mothers whose children were suffering with either HIV or cancer or, diseases where I was the palliative care nurse practitioner sitting alongside of them talking about, what end-of-life care might look like, talking about pain, talking about those things. And, and I feel like there was a certain level of compassion within me, but then I experienced it as a mom, and I just realized I didn't have any idea how much it actually hurts. And to go from being a professional caregiver to also taking on the role of doing it as a personal caregiver, and that shift and needing to hold the balance of both, because I needed to advocate for my kids to really give them a chance to survive while also holding the grief and the just the vulnerability of how much it actually hurt.
Yeah. So tell us what happened in the process that made you decide in the ultimate treatment of bone marrow transplants. How did you get to that decision point?
So one of the things that's been remarkable of living in Kenya is I've had the village community that has been just this beautiful experience to live life in community. But then a larger community around that would be with AMPATH, which is it's this consortium of medical schools who are working in the area and doing remarkable work around HIV, but also all kinds of other health issues at this point. And I've gotten to work alongside of many wonderful doctors for many years. And so when we got the diagnoses, I reached out to just the people I knew, and just because I wanted to learn what would make it possible for my kids to be able to have a better chance to live. And so there's a doctor from Indiana University who is a transplant specialist, but she's done a lot of work in Kenya. And so I reached out to her, and she said, Julie, if there's any chance that you could do the HLA testing and see if any of the siblings might be a donor match for any of these kids, like, I highly recommend you consider doing bone marrow transplant. Obviously, it can't be done in Kenya or even in the region, but if there would be any way that you could do that, like, that is our standard of care now for kids with sickle cell. If they have a sibling donor match, that we do that in the U.S. So,
there was no option in Kenya to do that.
No, so they don't do any. There's no transplants, no bone marrow transplants. We couldn't even do the testing. No labs would run the tests there. But there were just, there were 1,001 probably steps to, to find our way through, and hurdles to jump to try to see what might be possible for these kids. So we were able to do the labs, send them to New York, and again, I got an email saying that our baby Ryan and his brother Joffrey both had a sibling match, and their sister Sharon and then Alice didn't have a match. And so we eventually were able to identify that UCLA would be the treatment center for Joffrey and Ryan, and it felt like the decision would be giving them a chance to live, and for us to continue to be in Kenya like we wanted. Obviously, we grieved. It was bittersweet that Alice wouldn't have that kind of opportunity, but that was a decision that we made with what we had.
So tell us about Sharon and her beautiful spirit, and what that was like to make a decision with her that she would gift her brothers with her bone marrow.
Yeah, so when we sat in a doctor's office, or an office space, and we did cheek swabs on all of these children and sent them off, like, we knew that each sibling had a 1 in 4 chance of being a 10 out of 10 match. And when we got the results back that Sharon was the 10 out of 10 match for both Joffrey and for Ryan, I sat with her once we were able to get through all the steps, and just asked her if she'd be willing to do that, explaining minimally what that was, because I think there was only certain things that she could probably relate or understand too. But when we were at the U.S. Embassy applying for our visas, she told the interviewer that she hoped to go to the U.S. so that she could give a portion, a piece of her blood to help save her brothers. And so she's this beautiful girl who has experienced so much loss and grief, but has a resiliency and just a beauty that I'm so grateful to be able to be a part of loving her. And
her creativity and artistic ability struck me when I was spending time with her, and just that sort of giving soul that she has.
Sure. I mean, our kids, we brought them here when, language, they didn't necessarily speak in English, and they didn't have experiences outside of a village context, and we brought them to Los Angeles, and we wanted to protect them while also giving them, an experience here to be able to just let them know how much they're loved, and that this, even though in this world of plenty, it was lacking home, it was lacking their other brothers and sisters. And
so that sort of brings us to this place of the bone marrow transplants at UCLA, the time spent there, quite a home away from home for a lot of months for both you and Titus and the boys. And maybe could you just start by sharing a couple of experiences there, maybe the things that stood out to you, moments that felt like they were big moments in your journey?
As a nurse and sitting now as a parent versus having the role of a nurse at the bedside of my kids for many, many days, I was always really grateful for the nurses, the doctors, the healthcare providers who walked into the room and they treated my children like they were more than a bed number or a diagnosis, when they took the moments to pay attention to the story and to see that these little boys had traveled the world to receive their care. I felt grateful for nurses who I feel like straddle the line between getting a job done and loving, which is kind and brave, when you're in the transplant season where, the outcomes are not certain. So I just felt like we were always really grateful for, the doctors and nurses who cared and who, even when things were not going as expected and when the side effects of chemo would cause us to be in an ICU and really to be so close to death. Like I felt really grateful for the team that would continue to be human and continue to care in the midst of doing really technical things with our family.
I remember having a conversation with you during this season where you said, all these nurses are saying, how are you? How are you? And I don't always know how to respond to that. And I wonder if you could just articulate what was helpful for people to say, or ways that they accompanied you in a tangible way.
Yeah, so the nurses, the doctors, they'd come in one after another, and we're really sitting on the edge where we don't know if Ryan's going to live for another day, and people are asking me, how are you? And I remember when the transplant team came and the doctor said, well, how are you? And I looked at him and I said, well, what would be an appropriate answer? Because it's a normal question, but it felt way too big to answer. And it's not like you want to go into detail with everyone who walks in the room. And so his reply was devastated. And I said, well, that's where I'm at today. Like that's how I feel today. And I felt like reframing it as, in light of everything going on, how are you doing? Or how are you today? Or like making it a little bit smaller is how I needed to receive it. Now I get that everyone has their own way to process loss and grief and walk through these situations, but I felt that was more helpful to me than some of the vaguer questions that couldn't be answered, or were just too big for the moment.
I love that statement of how are you today, making it about this moment in this period of time.
Yeah, and so we started transplants with our 19-month-old who couldn't speak, but then we eventually, 100 plus days later, would do it again with Joffrey, and he did have words. And so one of the things that I found really helpful, and so people who work with kids, is to make sure that we're not asking a question as a question unless they have a choice. So like with Joffrey, they would, the doctor would say, can I take your blood pressure? Which obviously that wasn't a choice. And so he'd say, no, thank you. And so,
very kindly.
Yeah, no, thank you. Can I look in your ears? No, thank you. And so it became more helpful to say, can I use your right arm or your left arm? Like the things that he does have a choice about, then that's okay, but not to ask it in the form of a question unless it's actually a question. I found to be like something that I learned more about because of the experience.
Is there anything that you learned about how to talk with your kids about what was going on? You said earlier that when you mentioned to Sharon how this would unfold, that she was able to put it into a little more of a clarity for herself. What about the boys? Did they have a sense of what was happening for them?
Well, I think for Ryan, because he was 19 months old, so I feel like it was just more of being the comforter and holding him and making sure that any time that we could reduce the traumas that were coming at him in any way that we could to like advocate on his behalf. But I think the language piece came much more in with Joffrey, someone he was 3 years old, but really verbal, and just trying to help him understand in ways that, a 3-year-old can understand, and not, thinking that he can't hear some of these words, like trying to make things understandable, giving him information, but at appropriate age levels. So
yeah, I want to ask you about what happened when you returned to Kenya. You spoke about the need to really bring in your community at the beginning of the diagnosis, and as the devastation of that diagnosis came, you turned to community and asked them for support and care. And your community did that same sort of thing on the other end when you brought the boys back. And so could you share that experience of what it was like to go back to Kenya?
Well, I feel like Kenya is often referenced as a place of being a resource poor setting. But it's not entirely true. There's things that for sure would fit into those categorical, things, but Kenya is resource rich in other ways, in hospitality and community and showing up to celebrate, showing up to grieve, showing up in the day-to-day activities of life is something that we do extravagantly well. And it was one of the things that when we were leaving Kenya to come to the US that I was really concerned about. I didn't know if we would be able to find community in the same way. And the transplant doctor from Indiana, her name's Jody, she had told me, she's like, in order to survive transplants, you guys need community around you. And so when we moved to Los Angeles, we were welcomed and received by a family here that became really community for us in a way that we needed desperately. And their friends, their family, people around them just stepped in ways that, they loved us with such courage, such just reliability in ways that we needed. That we lived with them for 477 days. So when we were leaving to go back to Kenya, it had been 480 days that we had been away from the village, and we walked back into the village, and masses of people were in the dirt paths around our house. Hundreds and hundreds of people who gathered to sing to welcome us home. And I could hear the sounds of their singing long before I could see their faces, but just like being received in such a beautiful way, and just the joy that they got to partake in. We were away, but they had prayed for us. They had waited for us to come home, and now we had found our way in ways that at times, like, it didn't feel like all 6 of us would be able to make it back home. Like, it became so hard, where the dream of having a cure, but also even getting to all go home together didn't feel like it was going to be a possibility. And then it happened, and there was a community who had walked with us on this side, and a community in Kenya who received us and continued to love us through that.
So I want to go back for a moment to the community that was built here in the U.S. as you were in the midst of that. And I remember a story, if you feel like sharing, about the high schoolers at the high school next to Mel and Mary's house. Would you just tell that story? So
the family that we moved in with, initially, like, we were just supposed to be there for a couple of weeks. There was a guest house that we were moving into, but just the way life turned out, we remained in their home, and they welcomed us and made space for us. And there were toddlers, there was chronic illnesses, there was multiple hospitalizations. There was so much that made it difficult and complex. But their 17-year-old son, Micah, went to high school across the street, and he had 15 to 20 friends, high school seniors who came over every day, and they had come to do homework and to rest and to have a after school meal, and they just became our community in a way that we needed so desperately, and I never imagined that's what it would look like.
A group of teenagers.
Yeah, I mean, they held our children in a way that really, I think, made the whole thing possible.
We speak in nursing about the need for support and identifying support systems, and sometimes we forget that support is very unconventional, or it's a created family. It's not necessarily the people who you were born into family with, but it's the people who become your family in these spaces.
And I think there was this piece of, Titus and I had said yes to this baby that was in front of us and wanted him to have life, and the same for the brothers and sisters. And then there were these other extended people who continued to echo that yes. And even if they didn't know the whole story, they just continued, I think, to live out with their lives in whatever situation. It was high school seniors who were just affirming the worth of our kids in the way that they interacted with them every day. So it was really, really something that as a mom, I'll forever be grateful for just the community that received us and carried us. And when it got too hard, that they didn't drop us.
They didn't bail. They
right.
stayed around. Yeah. There's so much evidence in trauma research that talks about rhythm and regularity of movement and how it downregulates trauma responses. And so you were talking about music. We were talking earlier about music and how community brought music to you in Kenya. And we've talked a little bit about music in general, how it's threaded throughout your book. It's threaded throughout your story. Can you talk about that a bit and what was meaningful to you in integrating some of that music into your story?
Yeah, I think that music has always been this resource for me of calming, of celebration, of grieving, whatever I think the emotion is, it's helped to hold me. And interestingly, there was a moment, weeks, months, where it all felt hollow. It just, the amount of trauma, the amount of grief that we had, I think it was hard to even connect with some of the things that were once really life-giving. And yet, I think that it was finding ways to keep breathing and to touch the grass and to take a shower and have water touch you and remind you that you're still alive when you don't feel like that. And I think there's the whole fight or flight where you have all of these hormones and endorphins and things that are keeping you for a season, and then they run out at some point. And so it's just trying each day to continue to find what are the things that will give you the strength, give you the courage, because we talk about resilience, but I think it's also the vulnerability to allow yourself to continue to feel. And there were a few things that were very helpful to me in the darkest of times. One was for a mantra, I would say, that I had heard on a podcast with Father G from Homeboys Industries, and he talked about whenever he was going to go into a meeting or whenever he was walking down the street, he wasn't necessarily saying God or Jesus. He was saying, now hear, HERE, this, now hear this, and how do I remain present in this moment, to the person in front of me. And that's what I needed, for those moments where I didn't really know how to necessarily focus or not get too far ahead of where we were at, but to be present to the child that was in front of me. And just even when everything felt like it was lost and death was going to come, just this conviction, the goodness of God hasn't changed. And I felt it so deeply. It's the one thing I could hold on to is the goodness of God hasn't changed, and he loves this child more than I can comprehend. And those are the things I could hold on to. I didn't need it to be especially meaningful. I didn't need to learn any lessons at that moment. I just needed to be present and just to continue to remember that God was good and that he loved my child.
I have this image in my mind of Ryan when he moved into the ICU, and this tiny little boy with his hat on. He had a hat on because his head was cold, in the middle of all of these machines and just giant space. And I remember standing there with your husband. I think you actually maybe had gone for your shift of sleep, and he was there, and he sang in Swahili the song there's no one like Jesus. And I remember the nurses just sort of standing outside, just kind of watching in to this, like, what's happening in here. And I thought at the time, they have no idea the strength of the statement that was being made in that moment, because that, I mean, not many people would stand up and say that in the moments when you think your child is dying. And it was a beautiful thing to see Titus in his father energy, really saying, like, no, this is what I know to be true.
I would also just add, like, and then, you know, as we finish the transplants, as we have the months and months and months of recovery for them physically, but for us emotionally and spiritually to try to recover, it also made me really begin to think about, as a nurse practitioner, as a leader of an organization caring for children who die or who suffer greatly, like how, again, I didn't feel like my child's suffering was to teach me a lesson, but certainly a side effect of it has been the ways that compassion has grown within me, and my heart has been enlarged in ways that, you know, I didn't necessarily want to experience what we did to get there, but is now part of the way I envision the work that we do in moving forward.
Could I ask how you look at your co-parent, your husband, differently after this season, or in what way you needed to support each other or be supported to go through that? We know that a lot of folks who are in the midst of that really struggle in relationship because of just the stress of what it's like to have one child, let alone two children, go through this. So what was it that was helpful for you and that stayed connecting?
I mean, I loved Titus very much before these children, but the way that he has shown up, like with his strength and kindness, and faithfully done it over and over and over again, like, for us, it definitely, like, I'd never loved him more than watching him do that, because it took courage. But for sure, it's hard, you know, like, it's hard because there are days where communication is just really challenging, like, you're feeling so much, and to find the words, it's too much, you know. But for us, thankfully, like, to this point, I feel like we were able to stay connected. We were able to show up for our kids and for each other in, you know, I think, acts of service and in ways that helped us to get through. And
community came around you to support you in being able to
and like that. In really ways that I couldn't have dreamt or really prayed for. People stood alongside of us and held us and just they didn't leave us alone. Like, when I was writing the book, one of the editors was talking about, you know, like, did you feel alone? And I was like, no, I felt a lot of things, but alone was not one of them. And I'm grateful for that.
So tell us how the boys are doing now, what life looks like now post-transplant.
So it's interesting when we go into doctors' offices that are not connected to, like, the transplant department, they're still, like, I think, dumbfounded and surprised, you know, doctors, nurse practitioners who are like, now wait a second, why did they have a transplant? And I said, well, because they had sickle cell. And they say, well, then what happened to the sickle cell? I said, well, they don't have it anymore. And I feel like, you know, like, for me, it's like, well, that's what happened. And I mean, it took so much to get there, but our boys are thriving and they're free of sickle cell, and they're not on any medications. And Geoffrey will say, I used to have sickle cell disease, and they have, each boy has 100% of Sharon's DNA, within them. And so I obviously don't know what the road ahead will look like for them, but I'm really grateful for the freedom that they have from sickle cell. Because I think as a nurse who had taken care of sickle cell patients before, I thought that sickle cell was like, you do okay, and then you have a crisis, and that's when your pain starts. And that may be the case for some, but for my kids, it was much more like we had pain almost every day. We had issues like that from day to day. You didn't know what would happen next. And so I feel really grateful that the boys are freed from that, while we still hold closely that Alice still struggles with the disease, and we're still managing it and trying to see what options will be available for her. And I feel it deeply for all of these other families whose children have a 90% chance of not making it to the age of 5. And I was recently with a doctor who was saying, we're really working so that they'll be able to live to 5. And I said, well, as a mom, that's a good goal, but it's not enough.
It's not enough.
And especially when in other places in the world, they're living the 40s and 50s. Like 5 isn't enough. And so I feel like that disparity, the inequity of your chance to survive should not be based on where you were born. Geography should not determine whether a disease is treatable or not. And so I feel like we have a lot of work to do and advocacy work to do. And I want to be alongside of others who are fighting on behalf of these children and their families, and not just for survival, but also really looking at the pain and the symptom management that also needs to be addressed and managed.
And in your book, you outline quite a bit of what happens when a child is born in Kenya with sickle cell versus if a child is born elsewhere with sickle cell. And as you're saying, advocacy and the need for that, what can any common person do in order to create more of a sense of equal opportunity for health care for children with sickle cell?
Well, I mean, I think it starts at this point with knowledge, like beginning to understand that there is a disparity. Like, I actually didn't know before it was my children. I didn't know that the disease was like it is in sub-Saharan Africa. Like, I was living in the middle of it, but my focus was elsewhere. And so I think in the same way that for me, like, I was touched by it in a way that it's like, well, there can be a better way. I feel like within our Ministry of Health, like, there needs to be advocacy to be able to get newborn screening. There needs to be, simple treatments that can, like, drastically change whether a child will live or not. But you need the diagnosis to be able to get those implemented. And so, I'm not sure, Sarah, like, I'm not sure all of the different steps.
Stepwise,
but I feel like it's something that should be possible. And even if it's, so while we were going through transplant, we came across this saying that said, difficult things take a long time. Impossible things take a little longer. And I feel like that's what I want us to be about, is like not limiting if it's difficult, we can go after it, but if it feels impossible, it doesn't mean that it can't be done. It just means it needs more work, it needs more time, it needs more commitment.
Yes, and more courage to say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to keep working.
And somewhere in the middle of treatment, we began to say that love makes us brave. But it's costly. So I think that sometimes we will talk about courage and we see it only for the positive side of it, but I feel like there's a piece of, like, even though it's costly, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be something that you work towards.
Yeah. Could you read for us the section of the book where you talk about the invitation of Ryan's life and what he was about to gift you with?
Sure. So this is about the day that we brought Ryan to our home. I write that most of what we were saying yes to was left unscripted. Something inside me knew everything we needed to learn would come from holding him, from listening to his heart, from watching him breathe. He would grow one breath at a time. Ryan's life was not an accident, and his story, as tragic as it felt, was far from over. His life was an invitation before us. What we were saying yes to was far from a full picture of what might come, no clear understanding of how long Ryan might be within our care or even be alive. Those were questions to be asked on other days. Nothing or no one forced us one way or another. We had a choice. And it wasn't necessarily that there was a right or wrong way, but there was a yes and a no. There was a stopping to pay attention, interrupting our plans and the way we imagined our family would grow as we chose to affirm Ryan's worth, to discern and discover one day at a time what it meant to love.
You said that your question that you often sit with is, what does it mean to love in this situation? And it sounds like a lot of the what does it mean to love was to say yes and to show up.
And I think sometimes, people look at my life of like, she moved to Africa, like that was the biggest maybe sacrifice or the biggest step, but really it's not like that for me. It's more of like these moment by moment decisions, the things in front of us where we get to make a choice. And honestly, if we don't say yes, we're not going to know the difference, but just wanting to lean into what it might look like to love in this moment, in this situation, and not knowing what the outcome will be.
The end of the book has an update chapter that talks about Ryan finding his voice and the kids going on a family hike, even with some of their limitations, and the opening of the new hospice, the 49-bed hospice in Eldoret. So if you were to do an update chapter on summer 2021, where are things now?
Well, I think like everywhere in the world, COVID has been a challenging time, and that's for sure been true for us in Kenya. But I'm thankful that my children are overall healthy and doing well. That living room, that we're at a place again where we're dreaming of what are the next steps as we continue to care for the patients who come through our doors and the community. One of the dreams that we're currently working towards is in Eldoret. It's close to a government hospital where really thousands and thousands of people travel to come to receive care. And for families who are traveling from far distances and needing to have services like chemotherapy or radiation therapy that's just now becoming available, we're looking to build a guest house to be able to receive these families, to receive these children. I think about the way that our family was received. And, right now, many of these families who've traveled from far distances and really are they can't afford to stay in a hotel. They can't afford any place to hire, and so often sleep on the floor of, the emergency department in between getting, they get chemo and then are going to do it again tomorrow, but don't have a place to stay. And so as a mom who has walked the journey with my kids, I know how hard it is to survive even in the best of situations. And so we are looking towards building a guest house that would serve something like either the Hope Lodge of the American Cancer Society does, or like Ronald McDonald Housing, to be able to care for these children and their families. So
wow. I heard recently someone talking about coming out of the pandemic and how it's as if we've been battling a war and are still in the midst of that in many ways, but that we have to look around and say, how have we been hit? Where are the wounds? And so this may be more of just a question that is kind of coming from me, but I'm wondering, how are you caring for yourself in this process of living after this story? What do you do to engage in your own self-care and just awareness of what you need?
Well, few months like after we had finished transplants and we were no longer in survival, I remember one night having, I don't know if it was a dream, but it was a word that I woke up in the night, and the word was enjoy. And I felt like it was this word that allowed me to be a little bit freer to take in, like, we had survived this thing that would, didn't feel like it necessarily would happen, and to be free to enjoy my kids and free to enjoy the life that we were getting to live. And yet, like, in going back to Kenya, I didn't realize, like, how long it would take me to come back to a place where I felt like I can begin to dream again. I can begin to think about next steps. Like, we were trying to survive and needed the time and space for that. And then I think COVID came in and actually in some ways gave a little more of a break and space because we couldn't necessarily make all the steps or set all the goals or all the things that we felt like might happen in 2020. It became more about, what does it look like to be faithful today, and what does it look like to love our neighbors? And in that, like, that's what we could respond to. But I'm feeling more and more just this desire within me to dream again.
Thank you, Juli, for being with us today and sharing your story and your journey, and for what you've written in this book, From Beyond the Skies. And so we thank you for joining us and hope that you have an opportunity to read this beautiful journey as well.